In the cloud era, web services have evolved with use of microservices, which are hosted independently in a cluster, allowing them to benefit freely from cloud scalability and resilience. We'll look at using a dual-tier topology to deploy a microservices application in 5 steps. First, we'll use Red Hat OpenShift to manage the cluster. Second, it provides network services for microservices to communicate within the cluster. Third, we'll add a Citrix CPX to manage and scale delivery of north-south traffic within the cluster. A Citrix ingress controller will manage the network communication configuration. And a Citrix ADC VPX will provide the north-south networking outside of the cluster for users to access the services from the cloud. Now let's take a look at how we would configure this. Here we see we have a Red Hat OpenShift cluster running, which is the first step in building our microservices environment. Red Hat OpenShift can be managed using the GUI or through the command line. Here in the CLI, we'll see that we begin the configuration of our Apache services by editing a YAML file used to specify configuration details. We'll set the number of replicas to 2, which indicates we'll have 2 pods running within our cluster. And with the saved YAML file, we'll run a command on the CLI to begin the installation of those Apache services. This will be the second step in building our microservices environment. Once we have those services running, we'll return to the GUI where we'll see that we have those 2 pods running. And then under networking, we'll enter basic YAML configuration details to specify the ports that we want to use to run services in the cluster. Now we'll navigate to the operator hub and look for those Citrix CPXs. This will be the third step in building our microservices environment. Once we find the Citrix CPXs, we'll select them and we'll use the basic configuration information. We'll do the installation, which will download and install the executable in our environment. And once that's available, we'll navigate to it, where we'll go ahead and actually create the instances of the CPX. We'll navigate to the YAML view, which will allow us to specify configuration information. First, we'll set to true the license configuration, which will use the local license server to obtain a license file for the CPXs. And then we'll specify an ingress class tag, which will allow us to contact the CPXs and identify them within the cluster. Then we'll go ahead and create the CPX instances. Then we'll return to the CLI, and then we'll execute a command to verify we have those 2 H8 instances running. Now we'll enter a command that will allow us to run native ADC CLI commands on the CPX. And then we'll run a shell script to actually execute those commands. And first we'll specify show version, which will show us the version running on the CPX instances. We'll also specify show IP address, which will indicate the 2 IP addresses configured on the CPX instances. And then we'll run a Red Hat OpenShift command, which will allow us to see the IP addresses configured in the cluster as well. And we'll see that the cluster IP address configured corresponds to the one that's configured on the CPX, as we would expect. Next, we'll navigate to the VI and we'll edit an Apache ingress configuration YAML file. We'll start by using a like other file that we had available to simplify the configuration. We'll give it a name and we'll specify the ingress class of the CPXs we just created. We'll specify a host as well. This will be the FQDN that we'll use to access our Apache services. We'll set the path to the root and we'll specify the service name as Apache. Once we're finished, we'll copy this information, then we'll return to the CLI and enter it in a box for configuring the ingress under networking. Go ahead and paste the information in that we just created, and we'll go ahead and create the ingress information, and then we'll actually gather the Citrix CIC, which will be the 4th step in building our microservices environment. And again, once we install the executable, We'll go ahead and select the operator, and we'll create the instance for the CIC. Then we'll edit the YAML information, begin the configuration to integrate with the VPX, which is the 5th step in building our environment. Here we'll see in our browser, we gather the NSIP address, then we'll specify the secret information that will allow the CIC to specify configuration information on the Citrix ADC VPX. And once we have the configuration information entered, finally entering that we do not want to recreate CRDs that we built when we installed the CPXs, as well as we'll specify a unique tag for that VPX. We'll go ahead and create the CIC. And then we'll enter the IP address of the VIP, and we'll navigate to a browser and verify that we can contact our Apache cluster. Now we'll return to the CLI, and for the virtual server configured on the CPX, we'll see that we have the 2 services running. And so we've configured a scalable environment using Citrix and Redhat Openshift